In 2025, Donald Trump, after his stunning re-election, decided to make a grand entrance into Wall Street. He walked into the heart of the financial world thinking he would be received like a rock star. However, what he received was absolute silence. As Trump entered the annual finance summit, no one clapped. The CEOs and investment managers, instead of welcoming him, simply stared at him with little enthusiasm. Everyone thought Trump was the savior of the American economy, but the reality was much different. Instead of being celebrated, he was quickly becoming the nightmare of Wall Street. The moment Trump made his entrance, several investment managers immediately began texting each other. One of them wrote, "Warning, Trump just announced new tariffs on all goods from surplus countries. Get out of the market." Although no one wanted to publicly criticize him, the investors quickly started pulling money out of the stock market, while analysts began to prepare reports about global risk rising due to Trump's policies. The financial markets became chaotic, but not in the way Trump had hoped. While the financial experts were busy dialing their contacts and moving money out of the US, Trump remained confident. "You might not like what I'm doing, but I'm fighting for America," he proudly declared at a press conference. But the reaction from investors was not one of excitement. A group of investors at a cafe near Wall Street laughed, commenting, "What is Trump doing? He's pushing us into a financial crisis and doesn't even realize it." Out in the open, stocks of major companies like Apple, Tesla, and others dropped sharply. No one knew whether the economy would recover, but one thing was certain: Wall Street would never forget the turmoil caused by Trump's policies. When Trump arrived at the G7 summit in June 2025, he was confident that he would be the center of attention. After all, he was America's leader. However, he was in for a shocking reality: no one wanted him there. As Trump entered the meeting room, the atmosphere shifted. The other leaders, such as Angela Merkel, Emmanuel Macron, and Justin Trudeau, were all deeply engaged in serious discussions about the global economy, while Trump stood alone, looking at his phone. No one wanted to engage with him about his policies. The leaders all knew that any advice they gave would be ignored. The issue wasn't the substance of his policies, it was that they were too extreme and ignored the long-term consequences. Merkel, after listening to Trump talk about his new tax policies, quietly turned to Macron and whispered, "What is he doing? We are destroying everything we've built with our partners." Macron responded with a brief reply, "If he keeps doing this, we will face a global economic disaster." The issue wasn't just the trade policies, but Trump's ignorance of the broader consequences. His heavy-handed tariff policies against major trading partners like Canada, Mexico, and Europe were forcing these countries to seek ways to retaliate. While other leaders were discussing long-term global issues, Trump was speaking in slogans, not informed, but aggressive. When Trump finally spoke, he said, "We're not the poor ones anymore. We're going to make these other countries pay." This left the other leaders fuming. They couldn't hold back any longer. There was a growing consensus among the G7 nations that if Trump continued like this, the world would be in trouble. At one point, a NATO representative quietly suggested, "We'll find a way to deal with him, but not the way he wants." Trump's time on the world stage was coming to an end. The curtain had fallen, and the show was over for him on the international front. After the G7 disaster, Trump returned to the US, convinced that his tax policies would fix everything. However, upon landing back on American soil, the truth hit him hard: the American economy wasn't growing, it was beginning to stall. Governors from battleground states, where Trump had enjoyed strong support in the previous election, started speaking out. Florida and Texas, both reliant on agriculture and trade, started raising concerns about the negative impact of Trump's tariffs. These states, heavily dependent on exports, feared that retaliation from Mexico and other countries would cripple their economies. One governor from Florida, who had previously been a strong Trump supporter, began making public statements. "We can't let these tax policies damage our agriculture. If this continues, we'll have to reconsider these policies." These remarks weren't isolated. Whispers in the halls of the White House were growing louder: Trump no longer had full support. In a private conversation, a Treasury Department official sighed and said, "This isn't a policy for a president. This is the action of someone running a company without understanding the consequences." Large corporations, which had been Trump's backbone, began to pull back. Ford and General Motors cut production, while Apple announced they would move production outside the U.S. to avoid the high tariffs. Amazon followed suit, halting new investments in the U.S. The truth was undeniable: Trump's policies were pushing the country into economic chaos, and even his closest allies were starting to realize it. Trump's time in the international spotlight was short-lived. He was invited to the NATO summit in July 2025, but instead of receiving a warm welcome, he was quickly marginalized. The other leaders, while polite, clearly didn't want him there. Trump thought his presence would be celebrated, but it became clear that the world was tired of his antics. At the summit, Trump's speech on the new tax policy was met with uncomfortable silence. He began talking about how America wouldn't be a beggar anymore, but the other leaders simply exchanged looks and quietly discussed how to minimize the damage. The leaders were no longer listening to Trump. They were simply waiting for him to leave. NATO, traditionally a cornerstone of American foreign policy, was slowly crumbling under his leadership. And Trump, oblivious to the fact that he was becoming irrelevant, pressed on with his usual bravado. Trump's speech about how the U.S. needed to be tougher on its allies was met with eye rolls and nervous laughs. The other leaders quietly whispered that Trump was becoming a liability, and it was only a matter of time before his policies began to tear apart the alliances America had spent decades building. When Donald Trump returned to America in 2025, he imagined a hero's welcome. After all, his bold, brash policies were supposed to make America great again, and he believed his tax and tariff policies would be the key to revitalizing the economy. However, upon landing, the reality hit harder than an unexpected recession. The markets were not responding to his moves with the cheers he had expected. In fact, things were starting to spiral out of control. Trump had made several enemies on the world stage, but now he was facing opposition from his own country. The very people he had worked hard to appeal to in the 2020 election, the working-class voters, the farmers, the business moguls, were starting to question his leadership. And no one was more vocal about this than the Republican governors from key states. In Florida, Texas, and Michigan, states heavily dependent on agriculture and manufacturing, Trump's tariffs were causing significant harm. The taxes he imposed on agricultural products were now biting American farmers, not the foreign competitors he'd intended to punish. Farmers who had once been his most ardent supporters were now speaking out in opposition. A spokesperson for the Florida Agricultural Association issued a statement, claiming that Trump's tariffs were putting our farmers out of business. Trump's bold trade war against China, Europe, and even Canada had come full circle. It was now hurting American citizens. But it wasn't just farmers who were affected. Texas, a state whose economy was deeply intertwined with Mexico, saw a sharp decline in trade and investment. Trucks that had once moved goods swiftly across the border were now stuck in queues. The new tariffs on Mexican goods had a direct effect on industries like construction and automotive manufacturing, which relied on cheap materials from south of the border. The agricultural sector, which produced everything from cotton to soybeans, was suddenly finding its market share dwindling. The political fallout from these tariffs wasn't just economic, it was personal. Texas Governor Greg Abbott had always been one of Trump's staunchest allies. But in the wake of the tariff chaos, even Abbott was forced to break his silence. In an emergency press conference, Abbott declared, "These tariffs are no longer just an inconvenience. They're a threat to the livelihoods of Texans and Americans across the country." He called for a rethinking of the approach, demanding that Trump engage with state-level leaders to craft a more balanced trade policy. Abbott's words didn't just reflect the economic pain Texas was experiencing, they reflected the growing disillusionment within the ranks of the Republican Party. Even more damning was the reaction from Trump's corporate supporters. Major businesses began turning their backs on him. Ford, a company that had been a strong ally of Trump, announced it was scaling back its plans for new manufacturing plants in the United States, citing the increasing cost of doing business due to Trump's new tariffs. Apple, who had initially been a supporter during the campaign, now declared that it would move more production overseas. Amazon, which had benefited from Trump's deregulation policies, issued a warning that it would have to cut back on new warehouses in America due to the mounting costs of Trump's tax policy. Trump was baffled. These were the very businesses that had supported him and made huge profits during his early years in office. The realization that they were now pulling away from his economic vision was a bitter pill to swallow. And the corporate world wasn't the only one dissatisfied. The everyday American was beginning to feel the pain. In one particularly striking incident, a small business owner from Michigan said, I voted for Trump because I thought he'd make America strong again. Now, my business is struggling to stay afloat. I can't afford to pay these new taxes and import tariffs. If I have to raise prices, I'll lose customers. If I cut costs, I'll lose my workers. We're stuck. Trump's inability to control the fallout from his own policies was starting to affect his base. The once unified support for Trump was now splintering. People who had voted for him because of his promises to protect the American worker were now wondering if they had been sold a bill of goods. The Republican Party, which had long been a loyal ally of Trump, was beginning to fracture. Senator Mitch McConnell was forced to address concerns within his own ranks, trying to balance the party's economic philosophy with the pressure from Trump. Some members of Congress had already begun speaking out against the tariffs, claiming that the president's moves were more about ego than economic strategy. By the time 2025 reached its second half, Trump realized that not only had he alienated the world, he was also losing the support of his own country. The global shunning Trump had experienced at the G7 and other international summits had begun to manifest at home. He had become a pariah not only internationally, but domestically as well. Trump had initially been adamant that his aggressive trade policies would push the world to respect America again. However, what he didn't foresee was how quickly countries would adapt to his tariffs and how unpredictable the global markets could be. The US dollar, once a symbol of strength, began to plunge. The trade wars he had initiated against China and Europe were escalating, and the ripples of this were being felt around the world. It wasn't just the global powers that were distancing themselves from Trump. Countries like South Korea and Brazil, who had once relied heavily on trade with the US, started to shift their trade alliances. China, which Trump had believed he could easily corner, quietly began signing new trade deals with Latin America and Africa, areas that were traditionally influenced by American economic policy. Russia and Turkey, two countries Trump had claimed were, in his corner, began to edge closer to China. Seeing the writing on the wall, Trump's unpredictability made the US a less reliable partner. China's response was subtle but effective. They devalued their currency slightly, undermining the effectiveness of Trump's tariffs. This allowed China to continue to sell goods at competitive prices, while the US economy was caught in a downward spiral. Trump, however, refused to acknowledge that his policies were backfiring. Instead of shifting course, he doubled down, claiming that the tariffs were a necessary sacrifice to secure a stronger America. During a rally in Ohio, Trump declared, "The tariffs are working. The American people are going to win in the end. We'll bring jobs home. We'll bring back manufacturing." But back at home, the economy wasn't responding to Trump's promises. The stock market was volatile, and businesses that had once rallied behind him were now scrambling to find ways to protect their interests. Wall Street, the beating heart of American capitalism, was no longer buying what Trump was selling. Investors began to diversify their portfolios outside of American assets, especially after a series of poor earnings reports from major U.S. companies. Trump's international relations were in shambles. His relationship with Europe had deteriorated to the point where European leaders were no longer hiding their contempt. The European Union began to explore new trade agreements with other major economic powers, including China and India, bypassing America entirely. Merkel and Macron were openly discussing how to develop an economic partnership that would no longer rely on the US dollar as the reserve currency. This was a monumental shift in global economics, and Trump's inability to adapt to it was beginning to cost him on the international stage. The situation in North America was no better. Mexico, a country that had previously been at odds with Trump's rhetoric but had come to rely on the U.S. as its primary trading partner, began looking for alternatives. Trump's border tariffs were hurting Mexican industries, and in response, Mexico began seeking more trade deals with countries like Canada and China, gradually pulling away from the U.S. sphere of influence. Trump's final struggle. Back in America, Trump's position was also becoming increasingly precarious. His support among his base was beginning to erode. As the economy faltered and prices rose due to the tariffs, people began to question whether his policies were truly making them great again. Farmers were struggling, manufacturers were being hit with rising costs, and businesses were fleeing to safer markets. The turning point came when several major corporations, those that had once been his strongest allies, publicly denounced his policies. Ford, General Motors, Apple, and Amazon were all involved in major strategic shifts to protect their international business. At the same time, American consumers began to feel the pinch. Retail prices on everyday goods began to skyrocket, and the promise of cheaper American-made products seemed like a distant fantasy. People were no longer seeing the benefits of Trump's vision, they were experiencing the consequences of it. Trump's final days in office saw him isolated, surrounded by a shrinking circle of loyalists. The Republican Party began to distance itself, with key figures like Senator Mitch McConnell and Governor Ron DeSantis making more public statements about the need to chart a new course for the party and the country. The once infallible Trump brand was now a symbol of political turmoil and economic instability. End of an era. The 2025 policies that Trump had touted as revolutionary had led him to become a political pariah. His influence had waned, and his leadership was now seen as a dangerous experiment in political and economic governance. In the end, Trump had changed America, but not in the way he had hoped. The world had moved on without him.